My name is Rick Wayman. I'm CEO of the Foundation for Climate Restoration. Really excited to be here with you on this Saturday. So welcome to our Foundation for Climate Restoration monthly conference call. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Peter Fiekowsky, founder of the Foundation for Climate Restoration and author of the new book, Restoration, the Only Future That Will Sustain the Human Race. Peter is the visionary behind our organization's primary goal of reaching a future where the climate is restored and we've reached under 300 parts per million of CO2 by 2050. So you can all tell your grandchildren you were on a call that happened just after the launch of Peter's new book. Again, that title, Climate Restoration, the Only Future That Will Sustain the Human Race. I wanted to share a snippet of an interview, or sorry, of a review in Publisher's Weekly Book Life about this new book. Quote, Fiekowsky simplifies the science for easy comprehension and makes the case with such hopeful vigor that the book becomes something rare. A dead serious, no illusions look at climate change that doesn't stir despair. Fantastic review, and it goes on from there. So really excited to, again, have Peter here. Also very excited to announce that Peter is going to do a full 1-hour Q&A with us on Wednesday, May 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And the link for that Wednesday Q&A with Peter is in the chat. So Peter, I know that you're familiar with a lot of people on this call, but let me just, before I turn it over to you, let me give you just an idea of who you're talking with here. So as you know, many of our volunteers have already been deeply engaged with your new book. In fact, just before you got on, Diane told me that she has a stack of 10 that she's distributing to friends and family. She's not the only one. On our weekly calls, Terry and I are seeing people's excitement when they hold up a stack of your new book. And they're not just reading it themselves, they're spreading the word, they're getting it out. Terry has a stack right there. They're getting it out there, and that's really exciting, and really speaks to the great work that you do and the fantastic team that we have that is out there doing the work to restore the climate. So again, everyone, please remember to think of questions to ask after Peter's remarks. And Peter, over to you. Really honored to have you with us today.
Okay, well, thank you. It's great to be on. I think this is my first weekly call that I've been on. And I see Sam Daly Harris here. And for decades and decades, Diane Warren and I were on the monthly calls with results. So everyone, thank you for being here. And so let me display this. And so the climate restoration is very exciting. I like to describe it as the good news. And it's very seldom that we hear good news about the climate. And the good news is that simply we have everything we need to restore the climate by 2050. We have the technology, we have the economics, and the cost is going to be about $2 billion per year of commercial investment, which is about a fraction of a percent of what we're smartly investing in the energy transition now. So the money is easily available. And the bad news, and the reason that we're here, is that the public goals are insufficient to restore the climate. And being a physicist, I like to describe the science of these things. This is CO2 levels over the last 10,000 years. And on the left, you can see the warming at the end of the last ice age. And you can see that CO2 stabilized around 270, 280 parts per million. And agriculture began around here. Much of our civilization began around here. And of course, the Industrial Revolution happened around here. And we call this period of development our safe harbor. That is, we don't know what's going to happen at today's levels. All of us are experiencing storms and wildfires. And we do know that there's a safe harbor. When you are in a ship and you have a stormy sea, you head to the nearest safe harbor that you've been to and that you know is safe. To put this in perspective, this is CO2 again, but this is over 1 million years rather than 10,000. So it's 100 times a longer period of time. And you see ice ages. So this last ice age, you can think of New York with a mile of ice on top of it. And then I described agriculture develops, that's this little period in here. The evolution of modern humans, Homo sapiens, was about here, although some people say it was about here in this warm period. And the main point is that for 800,000 years, humans have never lived on more than 300 parts per million. We've just never had to. And of course, we don't know if we can. Many of it you have heard about the 350 parts per million limit, and that's one that Jim Hansen started talking about, and it's well accepted that above 350 parts per million, the survival of our species is in serious doubt. The ecosystems begin to collapse, and of course we're seeing that with the collapse of the permafrost, collapse of forests, the collapse of reefs. And we're right here. And the Paris goal is up here. And it's a little disconcerting, I think, for me and probably for most people, to realize that the Paris goal, net zero, 1.5 or 2 degrees warming, is way up here where the highest level we've ever survived is here. And the thing you can see here is nature has done this many times. That is, we need to get from here, back to this safe harbor. And that's the same thing nature did here 10 times in the last 1 million years. And so we don't need to invent something new. It's very exciting. We can actually figure out what nature did and do it faster. And nature, and so you would ask, what does nature do? Nature has 2 solutions for getting CO2 out of the atmosphere. Over very long periods, nature converts carbon into limestone, and 99.9% of the carbon on our planet is on the bottom of the ocean in the form of limestone, where animals and plants died, and their skeletons accumulated in as calcium carbonate on the seafloor. We can do the same thing. The other thing that nature does over shorter periods of time, so here again over 100,000 years, is photosynthesis in the ocean. Now, I think everyone knows that the popular notion is to have 1 trillion trees, because trees obviously synthesize, do photosynthesis and pull carbon out of the air. It's well known that trees typically live for some number of decades and then die, and then they rot, and the CO2 goes back into the air. So it's a great short-term solution. In the ocean, when I think of the ocean, I typically think of Hawaii and the blue ocean. And blue ocean is beautiful, but it's not green. Green is when you have photosynthesis. And so the question that nature had to solve is, how do you turn a blue ocean green so that it's you're getting photosynthesis? And when it's green, the plants in the ocean with the algae, they either sink or they get eaten by animals, which maybe get eaten by animals, which eventually sink. And in the deep ocean, there's not enough oxygen to rot. And so when the when the biocarbon, when the plants and dead plants and animals fall, they stay sequestered for tens and tens of thousands of years until at the end of the ice age, the currents change, there's oxygen available in the ocean, and that CO2 rots essentially, and the CO2 comes out very rapidly. And so if someone tells you that it's rocks, well, rocks are a little bit of it, but it's not CO2, it's not carbon that's fallen to the bottom of the ocean. It's carbon that's suspended in the ocean, which is the trillion tons of CO2, the same CO2 that we need to get out. And so, as I said, there are two pathways, and we know how to do them. The great thing about each of the pathways is that they have viable byproducts. So when the company here in Silicon Valley that makes synthetic limestone, and you're maybe wondering, what does that look like? Well, imagine an oyster. I don't know when's the last time you had an oyster, maybe not too long. And you have this little animal and this beautiful shell. And the shell is calcium carbonate, which is limestone. And the point is, it's not difficult to create calcium carbonate. The chemistry is not very difficult. The process took some development. And it's a very low energy process, right? Oysters and clams do not eat a lot of food, and yet they make these beautiful shells. And so by using that chemistry to create limestone, it provides the rock that we need for our roads and our buildings. And it's a $1 trillion business. So there's plenty of revenue to switch over from quarried rock into synthetic limestone. The first plant opened up last fall, and it's operating here in the Bay Area near the Carquinez Bridge in Pittsburgh. And the San Francisco airport has bought up all of their production for the next 2 years. So it's in demand already. And I think most of the people here are familiar with the fact that we're getting more and more rules last month for the government to require use of the synthetic limestone. The other one, which is actually faster, the fish and seaweed using photosynthesis. It's interesting. The way it's implemented is using iron dust. The missing nutrient in the ocean that allows the photosynthesis is iron. There's obviously lots of water and sun, and it turns out there's plenty of nitrogen in most of the ocean and phosphorus, but it's iron. And the difficulty with iron is that it's not very soluble, so it doesn't stay in the ocean long. Life has figured out how to survive with unbelievably low amounts. It's about 1/1,000,000th of a part per million, or maybe 10 times that, but it's still, it took until just 30 years ago for science to be able to measure such very small quantities. And it works. That is, we saw it earlier in the graph of the ice ages. I just was looking at it last week, and this is the CO2 graph. It's called the Keeling curve. I imagine you've seen it. It starts in 1957 when Professor Keeling started it. This one from the NOAA website starts in 1980. You can see CO2 going up steadily. It goes up and down every year. In the summer you get more photosynthesis. In the northern winter you get less, so you get the variation. What's interesting is Mount Pinatubo. Some of us older people remember 1991, a huge volcano in the Philippines, and pushed millions of tons of rock dust into the ocean, which had a certain amount of iron. And if you look at the CO2, you can see that the CO2 level had been rising steadily. It had been rising at a slower rate in the 70s, and then a somewhat higher rate in the 80s. It rose at the same rate in the late 90s and the 2000s, But there was a gap, and that gap is where the dust from the Mount Pinatubo volcano increased the photosynthesis in the ocean, and that 2.5 year hiatus in the rise of CO2. It's been discussed briefly in the literature, and I'm looking for a professor to help publish this in some way. But it's very clear that we can, in our lifetime, we've seen a 2.5 year hiatus in the rise of CO2. And you might ask, why have we not heard about this before? And the answer is that the public, that we've been told that the goal of climate is to reduce emissions. And of course, this has to do with levels and not emissions. So, and I'll wrap up there and really talk about what can we do. We need leadership. So the Foundation for Climate Restoration is positioned to provide the leadership in government. We're working with faith leaders, policymakers, to some degree scientists, to talk about that our goal is to restore a climate that humans have survived and can flourish in. So just in conclusion, we have everything we need, and we just need the leadership to say, this is where we're going to go. Then we'll go there. Sort of like having a car and gas. First, you need to say, oh, let's go to New York City. And then you go to New York City. Okay.
All right. Thanks so much, Peter. That was fantastic. Really appreciate that introduction. So let's see. If you have a question for Peter, please go to the bottom of your screen, click on the reactions button, and click on raise hand, and I'll call on you and ask you to unmute yourself, give your name and chapter, and ask your question. So let me just change my view here. Okay, fantastic. So we've got a couple hands up already. We'll start with Kathleen and then go to Carol. So Kathleen, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Kathleen Cronin, the Pacific Northwest team. Hi, Peter. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you again.
My question that came up was, where do we find the iron? Where are we going to find the iron to put in the ocean? And is that a big deal at all? Thanks.
Yeah, it's not a big deal. The amount is if you went to a steel mill, you would see a heap of iron dust, and that would be enough to do the whole planet. Yes, so it's not a big deal.
It's recycling.
Yeah.
Yeah, or reusing or
reusing,
repurposing what is essentially otherwise a waste product, right?
Yeah.
That's what we want. Thank you.
And the cost is minuscule. The implementation 10 years ago, where they removed about 80 or 90 million tons of CO2, used 70 tons of iron sulfite, I think, or sulfate.
Say those numbers again for me, please.
1 million? The iron used was 70 tons, and it removed about 80 million tons of CO2.
Thank you.
And the data got lost for political reasons. It got destroyed by the Canadian environmental EPA. There were this weird long political story involved, and so there aren't any scientific reports, but you can see it in the CO2 levels. And you can really see it if you look at the historical chlorophyll maps from NASA.
I want to drill down on this because I live on Puget Sound, where things like this can actually be done.
Yes.
Next week. So my question is, does it have to be done annually? Is it a one-time deal? How often would you have to apply iron dust to the ocean?
Yeah. Okay, so the details are, to do it at scale, it's normally done in an eddy, because the circular eddy keeps it contained, so the ecosystem adjusts, and also it feeds the fish, because the main revenue is the fish. And so each eddy would be fertilized probably every 2 years. So there's a fallow year and then a enriched year. And the idea is it could be done more, but the first thing to do is to imitate nature. And when there's a dust storm or a volcano, it's always intermittent. So the plan is do it intermittently.
And it would just be, you just run a boat through, find the eddy, dump it, and go bye-bye.
Pretty much.
Okay.
At the moment, there are scientific studies being planned. They've not yet been funded, and that'll be one of the things that the foundation can work on, is to encourage the government to fund these studies and to encourage foundations to fund them. And I can give information about the organization working on that.
Thank you very much.
And then the commercial operations to do it. They need to do a certain amount of science to maintain, monitor the chemical levels in the ocean, make sure that everything's working well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Great
Great.
questions, Kathleen. And before we go over to Carol, Peter, I just wanted to kind of follow up slightly on that, which is, can you just talk about the fairly recent National Academies study that came out that was encouraging further science, so kind of mainstreaming this this idea or this request for further study on iron fertilization?
Yeah. So the historical context is fascinating, and I'll give it quickly. But in 1990, I mentioned the first science on this got done, and they called it the iron hypothesis. And John Martin said, "Give me half a tanker of iron, and I'll give you the next ice age." And people were alarmed because, again, they were under the illusion that climate was about emissions, not about CO2 level. And if we reduce CO2 level, that would give us license to keep emitting. And so a lot of the environmental community did everything they could to stop it. The scientific community pursued it. Finally, in 2012, the Alaska operation happened. It looked like it did well. It produced huge harvest of fish. And part of the environmental community said, no, this is unacceptable. The UN says we have to reduce emissions, and this is a moral hazard. It makes it harder to reduce emissions. So we can't allow that. And that's, they made a lot of accusations, which scared off the whole scientific community. And that then takes us to the National Academies of Science study last December, where they actually came back, and the study was on oceans carbon dioxide removal methods. And in it, they said, for the first time in a long time, they said that this iron fertilization is a viable method. Now, as scientists, they recommended doing nothing but science for 10 years. Which they couldn't say anything else, because if they said we should do something, their fear, of course, is that their reputations would be destroyed by the environmentalists who said, no, we told you don't reduce levels, reduce emissions. Fortunately, that tide has turned now. And so the National Academy Science report came out in December recommending more studies. And then Schmidt Futures Foundation here in the Bay Area gave the initial funding to do that research. So it's just a $100,000 initial fund for the scientists to meet. But of course, the intention is for that to grow rapidly into a full-fledged research. But the important thing for people to understand is we'll be doing both in parallel, the research and the implementation, because it's been done, right? It's been done by Mount Pinatubo in 1991. It was done in Alaska in 2012. But there was very little science done in 1991. And the science that was done in 2012 was all lost due to political problems.
Thank you, Peter. Carol, over to you, please.
Thank you. My name is Carol. Hi, Peter. I just joined the Rocky Mountain chapter. I'm based in Colorado. I'm very excited. I'm going to get your book tomorrow.
Okay.
My question is a general question about the concept of climate restoration. As I understand it, we are saying today that if we bring CO2 levels in the atmosphere back to pre-industrial levels, we are going to restore the climate as we knew it. However, climate is much more than even just the composition of the atmosphere. As we know, it's also a function of the state of environmental systems on Earth. And those have also changed tremendously since we started emitting extra CO2. So my question is, do we have data that shows how the climate is going to actually go back to what we envision if we bring CO2 levels back down? Or do we need to be doing modeling studies to understand this a little bit better? Because we've lost our polar ice caps, or, our oceans have changed. So should we be also thinking about that? And what kind of climate do we think we're going to go back to if we reduce CO2 levels?
Wonderful question. So the answer is yes and yes. Let me show you. We did a preliminary modeling last year. A colleague here, Shannon Fiume, took the MAGICS model, which is widely used in the last IPCC report, and she did a climate restoration model for the first time ever, and you can see this is CO2 levels. You can see it going up, peaking. And then from here, she just assumed we would take out the 60 gigatons per year of CO2. And of course, by design, it gets to 300 parts per million by 2050 because it was designed to do that. And then CO2 continued on down. The result is that we got to 0 degrees warming by 2100. And of course, the design of this phase was designed to deliver that point. What's great about looking at CO2 is it's easy to measure, in Hawaii or anywhere. And the second is it's easy to control. That is, we know how to put CO2 into the air, and we now know how to get CO2 out of the air. And then, Carol, that leaves your questions like, well, when we're done, what do we end up with? And that's always a good question. And the second to the last chapter in my book addresses that. For the most part, we expect things to get pretty much back to normal. So there are, you've heard about major volcanoes over the last thousands of years, and there was the little ice age and all these things. So the ecosystems are quite resilient. And so most of our ecosystems will recover probably. And the Arctic ice, it will, and no one has modeled how quickly. And one of the things that I expect that the foundation will lobby for in Congress is funding to do that modeling. No one modeled it because no one asked the scientists, well, how do we restore the climate? The scientists were charged to say, tell us what happens if we screw up. We want to convince the policymakers to put money, and so tell us what happens if we screw up. They never asked, okay, tell us what success looks like. And that's really the heroic job that the foundation has. I think it'll be fun because people like good news. The only bad news on the future climate is sea level rise. There's no evidence that that's going to be a pretty picture, even with getting CO2 back. We don't know how bad it will be or not bad, but if you're on the coast, tell your great grandchildren to sell your house.
Thank you so much, Peter. And great question, Carol. That went by really fast. Peter, thank you so much.